words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It's a strange opening to the gospel narrative. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. Why even mention Jericho? I'd like to have heard a little bit about what happened in Jericho, the miracles, the teaching in the ancient city. But the action doesn't happen in the city. Rather, the drama unfolds as they were leaving Jericho, on their way out of town, on the margins. You expect the action to happen in Jericho. We know the song, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. But then, just as it often happens in our own lives, we discover that God is intervening where we least expect it, on the road out of town, which is today the road to Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples are going to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem, to remember how God rescued the Hebrew people from their Egyptian oppressors, led them out of slavery from death to life. And Jesus is going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover himself, but he will also become the Passover. He has been telling his disciples over and over that he will go and suffer and die and rise again, to confront and defeat the ultimate power of domination that holds all of humanity, the power of death. As I say those words, it is with a heavy heart, even though with deep faith and conviction, because with the deaths of our Jewish brothers and sisters at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, I don't want to spout easy Christian doctrine, but wrestle with the faith we claim, that there is life even when we are surrounded by death. Jesus is on his way. And for me, I believe that the way Jesus lives on the way shows us what it means that he is the way. Defeating death doesn't just mean something that happens when we die, but defeating death is when we choose to be life-giving instead of diminishing, negating, erasing, or silencing anyone. And there sits the blind beggar. He's sitting by the roadside. It's probably a good place to catch the pilgrims as they're passing by, a good place to get an extra denarii. Crowds would have been passing on that road headed to Jerusalem for the Passover. But notice in this gospel, he is not just a blind beggar or a leper or some other person needing healing. He is Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. He has a name. He has a father. He is a son. We are not told his story. We don't know why he's blind. Was it an illness or an accident? Or was it like in those days when they believed that it was some judgment on notorious sin? The story leaves out any detail of why Bartimaeus is blind, so we are not allowed to pass judgment on him. We are only asked to see him. We don't get to know what his condition is, but there he sits on the side of the road. Do you see him? Do you know him? Have you ever felt like Bartimaeus? Vulnerable, on the outside, maybe on the margins? Have you ever been kicked out of your family for some reason? When Bartimaeus hears the commotion of the group of travelers, he realizes that Jesus is in the crowd. And it says he goes off. He starts shouting. He's shouting and making a real nuisance of himself. Not like Oscar. Oscar can just yell all he wants. He starts shouting and making a nuisance. Notice what he shouts. Jesus, son of Joseph, have mercy on me. Is that what he says? No. He doesn't say son of Joseph. He says son of David, which was a messianic title. This Bartimaeus knows that Jesus is the hoped-for one, and he shouts, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Oh, what a bother he is. He's so noisy. I must admit, I probably would have been one of those well-meaning disciples that would have said, "Bartimaeus, shut up." Even though my mother told me never to say shut up. Be quiet. Jesus is talking to us. He's talking to us. He's telling us a really good story. It's a riveting parable. Be quiet. Bart doesn't shut up. Has he heard that the power of Jesus can heal him? Has he heard that Jesus will welcome him, that Jesus is compassionate on the poor and those who have been dismissed by others? What does Bartimaeus have to lose anyway? He could shout. He should shout. I think he has a lot to lose because he's blind and he's vulnerable. And to shout and be taken advantage of, he could be hurt. He could be killed. How easy to be intimidated by the voices of authority and back off, be quiet, not make a fuss. But it seems Bartimaeus knows Jesus can make a difference in his life, and he cries out. Will we too cry out for God to make a difference in our lives? Or do we get intimidated and quiet, silenced? Do we cry out that God will heal us and allow us to see again, to live fully? And who are those others who are crying out for mercy? I hear the voices of the children in the caravan. I hear the voices of transgender friends, of people who've been sexually abused. I heard on Friday Bishop Gene Robinson at the National Cathedral at the service for the interment of the ashes of Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old gay man who was brutally murdered 20 years ago. Bishop Gene cried out on behalf of Matthew Shepard and of every person whose voice had been diminished. But at the end of his sermon, he cried out, hoping that people didn't come to the service or weren't just listening on their phones to the service just to honor Matthew's life. He cried out that we would be transformed by the love of God. Bishop Gene cried out that the deep love of God would heal all of us, and that we too can be agents of healing in a broken world, that we might see and respond to those who cry out, that we might long to see. It is frightening to see how often the church, me, us, well-meaning disciples, are guilty of telling people to be quiet, whether we say it out loud or we say it by the way we dismiss them, as you are not important, the way we have diminished anyone. Or have you ever told yourself to be quiet? Have you ever silenced your own voice that's longing to cry out to God? I pray we will be people who will say, "Come on, my friend, he's calling you. He's welcoming you." Gratefully, Bartimaeus did not let the crowd diminish his voice. He persisted in prayer. How hard it is when people are telling us to be quiet. And Jesus doesn't answer Bartimaeus directly. Instead, he invites the disciples, those who had just told Bartimaeus to be quiet, you're insignificant. Jesus asks them to go and widen the circle, to make space. Jesus says, you go call him. You let him in. I can only imagine that those disciples must have kind of choked on their words, because in 1 minute they're saying, be quiet. And the next minute they're saying, take heart. He's calling you. Come on. I'll help you, show you the way. They thought they were protecting Jesus. But Jesus doesn't need any protecting from anyone. Bart doesn't need any coaxing. It says he springs up. So whether that means he's young or whether he doesn't let his arthritis bother him, he just jumps up. And it says he throws off his cloak. I wrote a sermon once. The whole thing was about going cloakless. What happened to the cloak? I do think it is a great question, and especially as today we are starting our stewardship focus. Bartimaeus threw off his cloak. His cloak would have been his protection, the shelter from the cold and the shade from the sun. It would have been the thing he used if he wanted to cover his face so people couldn't stare at him. It would have been what he used to throw out on the ground so people didn't touch him, but they could throw their money on his cloak. It was very real. It was his security blanket. He threw it off and came to Jesus, cloakless, relinquished, trusting Jesus will hear his prayer. Being cloakless has to do with my relationship to my possessions and my money. And it also has to do with my attitude of my heart. Because when I'm wrapped so snugly around with the cloaks of my securities, of my possessions, I don't need to be wrapped in the cloak of God's care. Cloakless, or hanging loosely, I stand open to God, vulnerable, available. And as we begin our stewardship focus, we consider, what are we doing with our many cloaks? I'm not suggesting only that you make another donation to the clothing closet. I suspect we all have extra cloaks. But I'm talking about being generous with your money, with your whole self. So as good stewards, we as a parish can do ministry that continues to enable us to follow in the way of Jesus. In a minute, we will celebrate the baptism of Oscar Thomas Raderstrong. It is an awesome celebration, affirming the way of Jesus. It is a celebration of being cloakless, because what happens in our baptism is we choose to relinquish the various security blankets, and we free fall into the arms of God, cloakless, naked before God. We discover the delight in being reclothed, recloaked in our baptism clothes. I will not make Oscar Thomas be naked, but he is clothed in the garments that his dad wore, and I think other family members wore, a reminder of just the wonder of our baptism clothes, which are more than just the cloth. It is a way of living, of being, of walking in this world, ready to follow Jesus. In a minute, in our baptismal promises, we will be asked questions. I will ask you questions. I will ask you what you believe about God and what you will do about it. Will you follow in the way of Jesus? Jesus asks Bartimaeus a question too. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" How would you answer if Jesus stood in front of you and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Last week, James and John had asked for glory and power. They'd wanted to sit on Jesus' left hand and right hand in glory, not knowing that it wasn't a throne, it was a cross. And 2 weeks ago, the rich young ruler had asked for a guarantee of eternal life. But when Jesus had offered to give him what he asked, the condition of total relinquishment was too high a cost. He couldn't part with his cloaks. But Bartimaeus asks to see Jesus, to have vision. Throughout the Gospels, seeing and hearing, healing of the blind is not about receiving visual acuity, which I wish I had better. Rather, it is about the nearsightedness and farsightedness of our vision of God and God's kingdom. I think how often I am like the person who puts their glasses at the tip of their nose and says, "Well, I can't really read it. I don't know what it says." And then we have that choice of whether we say, oh well, doesn't matter. Or, "Would you help me read it? Would you help me know what it means so I can have vision, so I can move forward with God?" Healed by Jesus. Healed by Jesus. Bartimaeus is free to go. He is given back life. I don't think he goes back and picks up that cloak, because now he chooses to follow on the way. And now we are going to join little Oscar Thomas as he joins a caravan to follow Jesus on the way and renew our promises to live in faith. Amen. And I ask you to join me as we sing Wade in the Water to get ready for the baptism.